50 years ago, a mountaineer dared to challenge the impossible, reach the summit of Everest, in the dreaded death zone, where every breath is a battle and life hangs by a thread. He set out in search of glory, but never returned. Swallowed by the ice and silence of the mountain, his disappearance became one of the greatest mysteries ever guarded by the roof of the world. And if you also enjoy delving into intriguing stories like this one, like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. When news of his disappearance arrived, the silence wasn't just on the mountain, it also invaded homes, slowly eroding hope. The family, once thrilled with the grandiose dream of seeing their loved one conquer the impossible, found themselves plunged into a void as dense as the storms of Everest. His wife, who had closely followed every preparation for the expedition, knew he was facing the most perilous challenge of his life. But she never imagined she would go without a single answer. The phone didn't ring, the letters never arrived, and all that remained were conflicting rumors, accident theories, stories told by other climbers that didn't actually confirm anything. It was as if time had frozen along with him, leaving everyone waiting for an explanation that never came. This waiting, in fact, is what most marks those who experience an absence. Unlike a confirmed loss, where there is a mourning with a beginning and an end, uncertainty becomes an invisible prison. The family was torn between two extremes, the hope that somehow he had survived, and the painful knowledge that the mountain rarely returns those it takes. At dinners, his place at the table remained empty. In conversations, his name came up amidst suppressed tears. On birthdays, his absence weighed more heavily than any gift. His wife often tried to maintain a firm stance, especially in front of her children. But deep down, she was gripped by a cruel doubt. Was glory greater than the love of life? This question echoed like a bitter sentence, the kind that allows no rest. The climbing community also felt the blow. Among them, there was a kind of silent pact, a brotherhood forged by shared risk. Many spoke of the missing man as someone who represented the essence of mountaineering: courage, tenacity, and a certain disregard for the limits imposed by nature. Meetings, lectures, and even tributes began to form, keeping alive the memory of the man who had disappeared trying to reach the sky. But at the same time, there was a latent unease. After all, each tribute was also a reminder that any one of them could be the next to disappear into the eternal snows of Everest. His wife, attending some of these gatherings, realized that everyone shared his grief, but none could carry it in his place. The following years only widened this wound. With each returning expedition, there was a glimmer of hope. Perhaps someone had found a sign, a clue, anything that would give the family a chance to end their suspended mourning. But the reports were always full of gaps, uncertain details, and possibilities never confirmed. Some claimed to have seen traces of old clothing in the snow. Others mentioned rusted metal objects on distant slopes. Nothing was solid. Everything was mist. And meanwhile, life went on, but always with the shadow of that absent man looming over the family's every step. Time, for those who wait, doesn't heal. It deepens. 50 years later, the pain was no less acute. It had simply learned to disguise itself. His wife grew old with questions no one could answer. His children grew up hearing stories about their father who dared too much. And the community, even decades later, still mentioned his name when speaking of courage and tragedy on Everest. His absence became almost a myth. But for those who loved him, it was simply an open wound. And just when everything seemed doomed to oblivion, A new generation of climbers brought to light disturbing images that would reignite the flame of hope and pain, as if the mountain had finally decided to reveal part of its secret. For decades, the mystery seemed dormant beneath Everest's ice sheets. Time, relentless, had transformed that disappearance into yet another legend whispered among mountaineers. But the mountain, like a silent guardian, doesn't usually keep secrets forever. It was on a recent expedition, now in an age of drones, high-resolution cameras and cutting-edge equipment, that something disturbing began to surface. The group of climbers, reviewing images captured during the climb, noticed details that didn't belong in the natural environment: a straight line that didn't blend in with the terrain, an elongated shadow that clashed with the snow, and, further ahead, a faded stain that resembled fabric. No one wanted to believe it right away, but intuition told them there was something, or someone, kept there, frozen in time. At first, many thought it was just an optical illusion. After all, Everest is a master at tricking the eye. Sunlight, reflecting off the snow, can transform rocks into shapes and shadows into almost human forms. But the more the images were analyzed, the more the details took on disturbing contours. One of the climbers, experienced in recognizing old equipment, claimed that the metal object seen amidst the ice looked like part of a buckle used on backpacks from the 1970s. Others swore they could make out a faded blue strip, possibly from a jacket almost erased by time, but still stubbornly resisting the fury of the elements. It was as if the mountain had decided, half a century later, to open a crack in its icy vault and reveal fragments of an unfinished story. The news soon spread. Initially confined to mountaineering forums, it gained momentum when the images reached experts. Veteran mountaineers analyzed every pixel, comparing them with old expedition records, route maps, and even photographs of the missing team. And it was at this point that the twist began to take shape. Some details of the discovery coincided exactly with what the missing climber had carried with him on the trip. The buckle, for example, matched descriptions in the diaries of other expedition colleagues. The blue fabric stripe was similar to the pattern used on the jacket he reportedly wore on the day of his last summit attempt. The family's hearts, which had already learned to live with his absence, began to beat again with a mixture of grief and hope. This kind of discovery carries with it enormous psychological weight. For the community, it meant a chance to solve one of Everest's most famous enigmas. For the family, it meant the possibility of ending a suspended mourning, or at least transforming it into memory. It's curious how material symbols have this power. A piece of fabric, a rusty buckle, even a mark in the ice. Anything can become the key to a past that seemed inaccessible. It's like finding an old letter in a forgotten drawer. The paper may be yellowed, but the impact of those words revives entire stories. So it was in the climber's case. Every small clue became an open portal to a lost time. As the evidence grew more consistent, the international press also began to take an interest. Headlines spoke of a ghost on Everest and frozen secrets revealed after 50 years. Reporters swarmed the family seeking emotional statements. But for his elderly wife, each question was a reopened wound. How could she speak of someone who never returned? How could she face the possibility of seeing in photographs the body of the man she loved, preserved like an ice statue? The twist was not just a matter of historical mystery, but of human pain. The world saw a spectacle. The family saw scars being forcibly ripped away. At this point, divergent theories also began to emerge. Some believed the discovery could rewrite part of the history of mountaineering. Some argued that given the location of the remains, The missing man had perhaps gone much further than previously thought, perhaps even close to the summit. This would raise the possibility that he was one of the first to reach the summit in his time, even before official records were released. Others, more skeptical, said it was unlikely. Everest had already yielded signs of clothing and bones belonging to other climbers at different points on the mountain, and there was no guarantee that this body, if indeed found, would be his. This division of opinion only heightened the suspense. On one hand, there was science, with its meticulous studies and analysis of satellite imagery. On the other, there was emotion, fueled by the hope of family members and the collective imagination. After all, human beings have always been drawn to unfinished stories. Think, for example, of ships that disappeared at sea and were found decades later, or of buried cities that only came to light thanks to archaeology. These cases not only solve historical enigmas, they also remind us of the fragility of our achievements in the face of nature and time. Everest, in this sense, proved to be not just a mountain, but an immense frozen archive of interrupted lives. As the months passed, the images were subjected to advanced recognition filters. Artificial intelligence programs attempted to recreate shapes from the captured fragments, and the result was even more disturbing. There was, indeed, the outline of a human lying beneath a thick layer of snow, arms curled up as if embracing their own body for warmth. The most striking detail, however, was the light hue in a specific part of the image, possibly the remains of a boot that, according to archives, matched the model worn by the climber on his final expedition. With each analysis, the doubt diminished and the anticipation grew. And like every major turn of events, this one also brought unexpected consequences. Mountaineers from around the world began planning new expeditions, driven both by the desire to solve the mystery and by the pride of being associated with a historic discovery. Debates arose. Was it ethical to remove the body of someone who had lain on the mountain for half a century? Or should it remain there, as part of Everest itself? While some argued that the family deserved answers, others argued that the mountain should not be desecrated, as each body there had become part of the landscape and collective memory. Amidst so much speculation, the only certainty was that the case could no longer be ignored. The mountain had spoken, albeit enigmatically. What had previously been merely an inexplicable absence now became a race against time, the cold and human limits to uncover the truth. The initial clue had been laid, and with it the twist that would change the course of the story. What no one knew was where this discovery would lead, and what secrets would still be revealed when experts and investigators decided to climb to the exact spot where the apparition had appeared and confront, face to face, the icy silence of Everest. The discovery of the frozen images wasn't just a spark for curiosity. It sparked a veritable frenzy of investigations. Universities, mountaineering research centers, and even technology labs came together to examine every detail captured. It was as if science had been summoned to decipher a riddle that nature stubbornly guarded. Mountaineering experts revisited old reports, compared logbooks, and crossed hand-drawn routes, trying to map exactly where the climber might have been swallowed by Everest. Every yellowed piece of paper seemed to carry invisible clues, and every account from colleagues on the original expedition turned into gold for those seeking to understand the missing man's final steps. Satellite images were processed in high definition, something unthinkable 50 years ago. Drones specialized in surviving extreme cold flew over areas near the indicated point, capturing unprecedented angles. What was once just a bluish smudge now transformed into more defined shapes, revealing fragments of something that undoubtedly didn't belong in the natural landscape. Scientists cautiously pointed out it could be a jacket, a backpack, perhaps even part of the climber's body preserved by the ice. The thin air and temperatures below 40 degrees Celsius created an environment where decomposition practically existed, as if the mountain had the power to mummify its victims. Historians, in turn, delved into forgotten archives. Among papers lost in libraries and records kept by relatives of other climbers, interesting details emerged. Letters sent before the trip, lists of purchased equipment, and even drafts of alternative routes the expedition considered. One of these documents mentioned the possibility of attempting a lesser-known, shorter, but also more dangerous route. Coincidentally, it was precisely in this region that the recent signs had been identified. This raised a fascinating hypothesis. What if the climber had actually dared to take the alternative route, disappearing not by chance but by strategic choice? As the research progressed, old theories resurfaced. Some argued that he had succumbed to an avalanche, explaining his sudden disappearance. Others believed he had fallen into a deep crevasse, the kind that opens like hungry mouths in the ice and hides its secrets forever. But with the new images, these possibilities began to fade. There were signs that he might have resisted longer than previously thought, leaving traces that have only now come to light. This possibility not only intrigued researchers, but also deeply affected his family. His wife, upon hearing the reports, felt her heart race. Could he have fought to the end, perhaps closer to the summit than everyone believed? The new analyses opened the door to a delicate discussion. To what extent could science recreate the narrative of someone who disappeared so long ago? For some, it was a fascinating archaeological exercise. For others, it seemed like an invasion of something that should remain sacred. Still, the human impulse to understand, to close open stories, prevailed. Specialized groups began proposing reconnaissance expeditions, aiming to confirm in situ whether the signs truly corresponded to the missing climber. The challenge was immense. Climbing to the death zone required logistics, courage, and significant investment. But the possibility of providing answers after half a century was an irresistible invitation. Interestingly, as experts pored over maps and images, the investigation also revealed contradictions in the original accounts. Some expedition colleagues, interviewed in the 1970s, had given differing versions of their last sightings of the missing man. One said he seemed exhausted and about to give up. Another claimed, on the contrary, that he was determined to continue, even alone. These details, forgotten over the years, took on new weight given the possibility of finding his body. After all, if he had gone alone, he could have reached points that would completely change the history of the Everest climb. The researchers also used modern 3D reconstruction techniques. From the images, they created digital models that simulated the body lying beneath the ice. Although still shrouded in uncertainty, the results were impressive. The proportions matched the climber's measurements, and even the position of his arms recalled accounts of how he used to protect himself from the extreme cold. One particularly disturbing detail was identified: a possible inscription on the backpack, partially covered in snow, that resembled the initials of his name. For family members, this sounded like definitive proof. For scientists, it was just another piece of evidence to be confirmed. The discoveries sparked debate at mountaineering conferences around the world. Some speakers argued that the case was a landmark in human perseverance in the face of nature, a reminder that Everest always takes its toll. Others saw the situation as an ethical warning. How far is it worth going in search of the truth? Would removing remains from a place like Everest be respecting the climber's memory, or would it be turning his tragedy into a spectacle? These discussions gave the case even more visibility, transforming it into something bigger than a simple investigation. At the same time, each new piece of information seemed to fuel the flame of hope in the family's hearts. For them, it didn't matter if the answers would come with pain. What mattered was ending the uncertainty. "I just want to know where he is," his wife reportedly said in an emotional interview. This phrase spread around the world, reinforcing the human nature of the investigation. It wasn't just about science, mountaineering, or historical curiosity. It was about love, loss, and the universal desire to find an end to pain. And so, step by step, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. What had previously been mere specks in the snow became solid possibilities. Ancient documents, modern images, contradictory accounts, and digital analyses intertwined into a narrative that demanded confirmation. The investigation was no longer a distant study, but the prelude to an inevitable action, organizing an expedition to climb to the exact spot, brave the death zone again, and finally face the secret Everest had kept for 50 years. When the first news about the evidence found on Everest began to circulate, it didn't take long for old voices to resurface. Men and women who had participated in historic expeditions to the mountain, many now retired from the sport, were sought out by journalists and researchers. Their stories, kept secret for years, resurfaced with an almost painful intensity. Some recalled details that seemed irrelevant at the time, but which now, in light of recent discoveries, were taking on immense weight. Some spoke of scraps of colored fabric spotted among the snow. Others recalled the distant sound of avalanches on stormy nights. Small fragments of memory that, woven together, created a patchwork of contradictions. Among the survivors of the expeditions of the 1970s and 1980s, there was an uneasy consensus. Everyone had come across mysterious clues somewhere on the mountain, but the brutality of the conditions always prevented them from investigating further. One of the most respected climbers, now nearly 80 years old, revealed in an interview that once, just a few meters from the death zone, he saw what looked like the outline of a boot frozen in the ice. At the time, he preferred not to reveal the story, fearing it would be mistaken for exhaustion fantasies. Now, however, his confession reinforced the hypothesis that the remains of the missing man could be found precisely in that area. This type of report generated not only curiosity, but also suspicion. After all, why were so many details hidden for decades? Was it simply a fear of fueling speculation, or were there greater interests at play? Some began to question whether the early expeditions had purposefully concealed information. This idea gained traction when old documents revealed discrepancies between official accounts and the informal testimonies of some participants. While public records claimed the missing man had abandoned the climb early in private conversations, some colleagues mentioned having seen him advance further than previously acknowledged. Everest's extreme conditions also figured prominently in this narrative. Survivors recounted how sudden avalanches swallowed men in seconds, how winds of over 200 km/h ripped tents and ripped off equipment, and how a simple change of route could mean life or death. A Sherpa guide, who had accompanied dozens of expeditions, recounted hearing stories passed down among locals about a foreign spirit frozen in the mountain's slopes, a mystical way of saying they knew of the presence of bodies preserved by the ice. The oral tradition of the Himalayan people, far from being mere superstition, seemed to indicate that human secrets truly lay hidden there. And like any story shrouded in mystery, Conspiracy theories soon emerged. Some believed the disappearance wasn't simply an accident or recklessness. There were hypotheses that conflicts within the expedition could have led to a fatal decision. Perhaps the climber had been intentionally left behind, or perhaps he'd discovered something he shouldn't have, and so his tracks were covered. Others, more skeptical, saw these ideas as merely the human need to create grandiose narratives when the truth can be simple: an exhausted man, overcome by the altitude, engulfed by the cold. But the lack of concrete evidence gave rise to all sorts of speculation. The encounters with these key figures brought not only new data to the research, but also a tense atmosphere. The clash of memories, documents, and assumptions raised more questions than answers. Even the family, already tired of conflicting versions, began to wonder. Why have so many people only now decided to speak out? Could it be that, amid this confusion of memories, there was also an attempt to manipulate the narrative to protect reputations or conceal flaws in the original expedition? At this point, the investigation was no longer just a search for remains or historical records. It was a battle between versions, a battlefield where memory and truth clashed forcefully. Each survivor had their own vision of what happened. Each local guide carried their own legend, and each expert tried to weave a thread of coherence into this fabric frayed by time. The disappearance, which had previously seemed merely a tragic accident, now took on the contours of something larger, almost conspiratorial. And this uncertainty, instead of shedding light, cast even more shadows over the case. So when investigators pieced together all these accounts and suspicions, they realized they were facing a puzzle that went beyond the mountain itself. It was no longer just about finding a body or confirming a route. There were human and emotional secrets involved, truths some would prefer to keep buried beneath the ice. And it was inevitable that the deeper they dug into this story, the more disturbing revelations would surface, setting the stage for even more intense confrontations on the next leg of the journey. The investigations, already stirring the climbing community and his own family, reached a turning point when new documents previously hidden in private archives were revealed. Among them were pages of hastily written diaries, unofficial reports from Sherpa guides, and even letters secretly sent to expedition sponsors. These records contained startling information. Apparently, the missing climber had not only resisted longer than previously believed, but had also advanced beyond the last known camp. In one of the pages, a fellow expedition member clearly described how he was obstinate, his eyes fixed on the summit, refusing to turn back even when everyone begged him. This passage came as a bombshell. After all, if true, it could mean he had made it much further than the official version had maintained for decades. The revelation sparked a wave of confrontation. Survivors were called for interviews, and conflicting versions began to emerge. A veteran Sherpa claimed he heard heated arguments at base camp, involving decisions about who would or would not be able to continue. One of the team's climbers insisted that the missing man was weakened, delirious from lack of oxygen, and that he would never have been able to continue alone. The clash of these versions not only deepened the mystery, but also cast doubt on the loyalty of the expedition itself. The possibility that colleagues had omitted facts or even manipulated historical records gained traction. After all, who would want to hide the fact that he might have reached the summit before other famous names? Among the documents, preserved personal objects were also found. A small compass, a strip of cloth, and even a scribbled note that seemed more like a farewell message than a simple travelogue. Upon learning of these finds, the family was overcome with conflicting emotions. On the one hand, there was relief in knowing that concrete traces had finally come to light. On the other, Each detail brought to the surface the raw pain of reliving his absence. His wife, already scarred by time, declared in an interview, "These discoveries don't give me back my husband, but they show me that he didn't give up until the end." And that is both beautiful and devastating. The clashes weren't confined to the personal sphere. Meetings between mountaineering experts, historians, and even local authorities became arenas for debate. Some argued that the missing man deserved recognition as a pioneer, someone who perhaps achieved unprecedented feats. Others, however, accused him of sensationalism, arguing that the lack of definitive evidence didn't warrant rewriting Everest's history. This division transformed the investigation into a symbolic battlefield. On one side, the pursuit of justice in memory. On the other, the preservation of established traditional narratives. Amidst all this, an even more disturbing hypothesis emerged. What if the climber, while advancing alone, had found something remarkable on his way up? Perhaps an artifact, an unexplored crevasse, or even evidence of alternative routes. This idea, though seemingly fanciful, was fueled by enigmatic passages. In some records, a colleague had written about a strange look on the missing man's face, as if he had seen something beyond the ordinary landscape. This interpretation opened the door to theories ranging from scientific discoveries to mystical ones. And as always happens in cases shrouded in mystery, the less clear, the more fuel for speculation. What had once been simply a man's absence now became a plot rife with hidden secrets, contradictory versions, and disputes over the truth. With each revelation, the tension grew. Who was telling the truth? Who was hiding something? The family, the survivors, and even the public watching the case felt caught in a puzzle of pieces that didn't fit together. It was as if the mountain had held not only the body of a climber, but also a tangle of human secrets, of choices made under extreme risk, which were only now beginning to emerge. And of course, these revelations couldn't remain just papers and memoirs. International pressure demanded concrete action. It was inevitable that a new confrontation, this time physical, would take place on the mountain itself. Someone would have to return, take a closer look at the frozen remains, and face the enigma that loomed over Everest head-on. The decision was made. A new expedition would be organized to reach the exact spot where the images indicated signs of the missing climber. It was as if, after half a century, the mountain had agreed to reveal part of its secret. But to do so, it required men and women to defy its fury once again. The planning was meticulous. Drones, thermal sensors, state-of-the-art cameras, and medical equipment accompanied the team. But even the most advanced technology couldn't eliminate the risk. On Everest, every step is Russian roulette, and any slight mistake could mean doom. As they approached the death zone, the researchers felt the weight of the hostile environment. The thin air burned their lungs. Storms appeared out of nowhere, and the cold seemed to cut their skin like invisible blades. Each night, the wind blew with a force capable of uprooting tent stakes, reminding everyone that they were in inhospitable territory. But curiously, the tension didn't just come from the natural environment. It also came from what they would find. There was fear of confirming the death of a man who had become a legend, but also of discovering uncomfortable truths about his last journey. The culmination of the expedition occurred on a clear morning, a rare occurrence on Everest. Advancing along the designated stretch, the team noticed marks on the ice, half-buried metal objects, fragments of blue fabric, and soon after, a rigid shape beneath layers of hardened snow. The silence was absolute. No one dared disturb that moment where past and present met. Slowly, They began to remove the ice, revealing the outline of a body preserved by the cold, arms curled up against the chest, as if struggling to hold on to the last of its warmth. The sight was at once beautiful and devastating. There he was, after 50 years, frozen in a gesture that blended resistance and surrender. The impact was immediate. For some, it was definitive proof that the legend was true. For others, it raised more questions than answers. Why was he in that position? How far had he gotten before succumbing? And above all, why had so many previous versions omitted clues that could have located him decades earlier? Tension reached a peak when, next to the body, they found a damaged notebook, its pages partially preserved. It was still unknown what was written, but the mere presence of that object indicated that there were more stories to be revealed. The expedition, which began as a technical search, turned into a direct confrontation with the mountain's raw, icy truth. The body wasn't just the final answer, it was also the beginning of new questions, and as the team prepared to descend, with the recorded evidence, the feeling lingered that, despite the discovery, Everest still held more secrets than it was willing to reveal. Confirmation was not long in coming. After meticulous DNA analysis and comparison with medical records from the time, there was no longer any doubt. The body found was, in fact, that of the missing climber. 50 years later, the mountain returned what it had kept in absolute silence. For the family, the news was met with a mixture of relief and pain. Relief because finally there was an answer. Pain because the confirmation materialized what, for decades, had lived between hope and suspended mourning. His wife, now elderly, declared in a choked voice, "I knew the mountain wouldn't return him alive, but at least now I can speak of him without a shadow of a doubt." Images of the discovery traveled the world, becoming a symbol not only of human endurance, but also of Everest's relentlessness. Magazines, documentaries, and news reports transformed the case into one of the mountain's most iconic stories, reminding the world that every achievement there comes at a price. Climbers from across generations paid tribute, recognizing the missing man as part of the legacy of all who dared to challenge the highest peak on Earth. However, the sense of justice didn't come only with the confirmation of death. It also came with the breaking of the silence. Documents, testimonies, and contradictory versions were now exposed to the light, and the truth, or part of it, finally emerged. The narrative that he had given up early fell apart. It became clear that the missing man had fought until the very end, possibly closer to the summit than many cared to admit. For his family, this didn't change the fact of their loss, but it brought pride. The man they set out to seek answers also left the mark of his courage. Thus, the case became a permanent part of Everest's history, not as just another body preserved by the ice, but as one of the most emblematic disappearances ever recorded. Justice came not in court, but in the recovery of memory and the certainty that their struggle was not in vain. Everest, with all its grandeur and cruelty, had finally told one of its secrets, but the feeling was that there was still more hidden behind the mountain's silence. The disappearance, now solved, did not erase the mystery, it merely transformed, till the climber, finally identified and recognized, ceased to be merely a painful absence and became a symbol, the portrait of a courageous man who dared to challenge the impossible. His story began to be told not as that of a man who lost his life on the mountain, but as that of someone who sought to surpass the limits of the human condition. Everest, with its stern face, was the stage for his greatest struggle, and also his icy tomb. For the family, the truth brought a belated but necessary closure. The wife could finally pronounce her husband's name without the doubt that had haunted her for half a century. The children, now adults, inherited not only the pain, but also their father's courage, the courage to carry on despite his absence. And the mountaineering community, revisiting the case, found in it a reminder that glory never comes without risk, and that nature, majestic and cruel, does not negotiate with those who defy it. Everest, in this narrative, emerges as a metaphor for life itself, grandeur and danger, beauty and tragedy, all intertwined in the same setting. Every achievement carries its price, and every extreme choice leaves scars that transcend generations. The climber, now remembered as part of the mountain's history, remains not only as a body preserved in the ice, but as an eternal reminder that human beings at their core will always strive to transcend boundaries. And this struggle, however painful, is what keeps us alive in the face of the impossible.